Hello, welcome to my kitchen. And today in Miss Clark's kitchen, we're gonna talk all about your all-time favorite topic, the French Revolution. Woohoo! So let's go ahead and jump right in. So the French Revolution is gonna start off with your main three estates, which is based off of the feudal system. So your three estates are gonna be, the first two are going to be really tiny. They're going to be made up of, first off, the clergy, and then the second estate is going to be all the nobles. And then the third estate is going to be basically everybody else. So a huge portion, like 95% of the population. However, that 95% of the population is going to have to take on the financial responsibilities of every other of the estates. And they are not going to really get any of the rewards from it because they're only making a very small portion of the amount of wealth, and all the rest of it is going to the top two estates. And in addition, the top two estates get an equal vote with the third estate, despite the fact that the third estate is 95% of the population. During this time period, where you see the death of Louis XV and then the inauguration of Louis XVI, and he is going to marry the Austrian princess Marie Antoinette. And Marie Antoinette is very well known for spending things very lavishly. Of course, when she gets to be a ruler of France, she is like a teenager. And so for her, neither one of them really knew how to rule. So they were just kind of living that teenage lifestyle, not really understanding and not really having good advice from people who are going to actually tell them what to do. Because Louis XVI is still living in his grandfather's footsteps, Louis XIV as the Sun King, as being this very extravagant king. And he's also following in his footsteps as far as participating in a lot of different wars. So he gets involved in the wars in the Americas, like the 7 Years' War between the British and the French. And then later on, he participates by sending a lot of money and a lot of troops over for the American Revolution as sort of a getting back at, it's actually kind of just like him getting back at Great Britain because he lost the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. They both go by the same name. So the first stage of the French Revolution is going to be from 1789 to 1792. And it's going to start off with the French people demanding a meeting of the Estates General, which is when all the estates meet together and vote to try to reform the system. Something that has not happened in several years. When they call the Estates General, it's very difficult for the third estate to get any sort of opinion out, to actually say what they need, which is surprising considering that it's 95% of the population. And at one point, when they actually go to vote on how to reform the system, the third estate gets blocked out. So members of the third estate go over to a nearby tennis court and they swear the tennis court oath, which creates this thing called the National Assembly, which basically said that we refuse to stop unless a constitution has been written to reform and get rid of the feudal system. Up next, we have the food riots that start happening in Paris. People are starving to death and they need something to happen now. And so one of the things that they decide to do is they decide to storm the Bastille. And the Bastille is the armory. There's actually not that many things in the armory at the time period, but it's more symbolic because it's this symbol of authority for Louis XVI. And for him, that's going to be a major sign that people are not going to be happy. With this creation of the National Assembly, they get to finally abolish feudalism. And this is also when they create this thing called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which is basically a first step towards the Constitution of the natural born rights that every man should have at one point in his life. Next up, all of this is happening in 1789. This is a pretty big year for the French Revolution. It's going to be the Great Fear, and the Great Fear is when tons of peasants are going to rise up against all of the rich nobles, and a lot of times they're going to be attacking them because the feudal system is going down in flames, and that's going to be a major shift in the estate system that they had previously had. Immediately after this, there is that women's march on Versailles. They are so starving in Paris that they march the 14 miles to Versailles and basically attack Versailles and force the king to leave Versailles and make the march back to Paris, where he pretty much lives the majority of the rest of his life until he and his family are either killed or executed or one way or another. They took out all of the church's land, a lot of the church power. You're going to see with the French Revolution a real draw away from Christianity, especially when we're talking later on about like the Committee of Public Safety. They're definitely going to try to stamp out all signs of religion. They're going to take away all that church land, making sure that any sort of papacy is elected. And they got to the point where the National Assembly was like, well, we kind of did what we wanted to do. We technically wrote a constitution. And so they created this thing, they shifted from the National Assembly into the Legislative Assembly, which basically says that the king is still in charge, but now he has to work with the different groups of people with basically more advice and more input from the people. This is also when they passed this thing called the Le Chapelier law, which basically says that there can be no union strikes, which makes the poorest group of people, whose name is the Sans-Culottes, very, very angry, and leads to an increase in rioting in Paris. The royal family decides to try to leave the city of Paris on this thing called the Flight to the Ardennes, which is, as you may know, unsuccessful. They don't make it out of the country. And this makes Austria very, very upset, because Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, was originally an Austrian princess. And she still has a royal family who is running Austria. And so Austria does this thing where it's called the Declaration of Pillnitz, which basically says that Austria will declare war on France unless they can make sure that the king has control. That moves into the radical stage. Now, the radical stage is going to be from 1792 to 1795. And if you think that this is pretty bad, it just continually gets worse. So the French declare war on Austria, which again does not look very good for the king, because as this whole thing is going on with Austria is right about when he decides to leave and try to run away to Austria. So if you're trying to prove your loyalty and then you're going to run to the enemy, it's really, really not making you look that great, especially when you're lots of beheadings going around. You don't really want to be doing that. So the French declare war on Austria, and Austria does this thing called the Brunswick Manifesto, which basically says that if you harm the King of France, we will invade Paris, which is not going to be good for anybody in Paris. So France is still trying to figure things out. They're now not only going through a civil war, they're also going through a European war. And they declare themselves to be a republic, which is going to be the first republic out of 5. By the time they get to the 5th one, which didn't happen until the 1950s, is when they finally managed to figure it out, kind of. Paris is really, really like going through it during this time period, especially there's going to be these 2 warring groups on who's going to have control over this area. Is it going to be the, basically now under the new republic, the ruling party is now called the National Convention. Lots of different names. I would go back through and look at that chart that we filled out over the names of the different governments, because it does fluctuate a lot. National Convention. Who's going to have control over that? Is it going to be the Jacobins, who have a lot of power through the Paris mobs, or the Girondins, who are going to be more moderate and are going to be based off of the peasants? And unfortunately for a lot of French people, the Jacobins win, and the main person who is leading the Jacobins is going to be Robespierre. And Robespierre is going to be running the new system called the Committee on Public Safety, which is ironic because during this time period, 20,000 French people are guillotined to death, including Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, which of course is not going to make not going to make Austria all that pumped with the way that France is really running things. So that time period where a ton of people, basically anybody who disagreed with Robespierre getting guillotined, that's going to be called the Reign of Terror. So this last phase that we get into is going to be called the reactionary phase, and that's going to be from 1795 to 1799. And this is when basically the moderates managed to take back control of the National Convention and this thing called the Thermidorian reaction. What a ridiculous name, based off of the time of year and the calendar. And this is going to be a major signifier because they do end up beheading Robespierre. And instead, they start to set up this thing called basically the Directory. And the Directory is a 5-person group who make all the decisions for France. Paris, being Paris, decides that it doesn't really like this and that it's going to mob and try to go against this general idea. And that's is when Napoleon gets his rise, because he manages to raise an army and he manages to put down all of this Paris mobs and manages to save the Directory for now. The major results that you kind of want to remember, the major works of art, the major things that come out of it, is number one, the most important thing is that the slaves in Haiti took the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, especially this guy, his name is Toussaint Louverture, and he is going to raise the only successful slave result in world history to be able to actually go against Napoleon's troops. Napoleon loses to the Haitian slaves, and that's going to be a pretty major force as far as going against slavery and towards the end of slavery. We're moving towards that. Women have going to be a massive role when we're talking about the French Revolution, whether that's going to be from actually fighting to being able to express their own opinions, especially with Mary Wollstonecraft's the Declaration of Female Citizen, the Rights of Women and Female Citizen. Her ideas are going to be massive when you're talking about the women's rights movement. And then there's also going to be a book written by Edmund Burke on conservatism, and he's disgusted by this French Revolution and the way that it played out and how normal people are just so untrustworthy. And this is going to really, really impact the ideas of Metternich later on. So these are going to be the 3 stages of the French Revolution, and then you should definitely watch my next video, which is going to be all about Napoleon.